On the day it happened, I was experiencing unbearable physical pain. It felt as though nothing could possibly help me anymore. But then something happened, something so profound that it still fills me with awe and fear to this day. That experience left an indelible mark on my soul. And it's no wonder, because I died. Not metaphorically, but quite literally. The doctors declared my death and stopped the resuscitation efforts. Yet, despite that, I continued to exist, though in a completely different form. What I saw beyond the threshold of life was shocking. I was dead for 15 minutes, but for me, that time felt like an eternity. This is how Killian Kentucky began his story, a tale of an extraordinary and inexplicable experience that followed his clinical death. Just a few months earlier, in 1986, Killian had moved to one of the tropical islands in the Pacific Ocean to pursue his passion, surfing. At the time, he was only 24 years old, full of dreams, and it seemed like his entire life was ahead of him. But soon, destiny brought him face to face with trials he could never have anticipated. Living a carefree, idyllic life on the island, Killian didn't think much about serious matters. One night, he went on a fishing trip with a friend. Diving near a coral reef, he was catching lobsters and fully enjoying the experience. Everything was going smoothly until his flashlight caught sight of a strange creature in the water, something that resembled a squid. Intrigued, Killian decided to catch it. Wearing gloves, he reached out, but the creature slipped away from his grasp. Later, he realized it was actually a jellyfish with long, nearly invisible tentacles. Just a few minutes later, Killian felt a burning pain in his hand but chose to continue diving. During this time, he was stung several more times. Realizing it was time to end the fishing session, he swam back to the boat, but the journey back became a nightmare. He had to swim through a dense swarm of jellyfish. One of them came dangerously close to his face, and when he pushed it away with his hand, he felt 2 more stings. The pain was agonizing, yet Killian managed to reach the boat. However, his hands were now covered in painful burns and swelling. When his friend saw the state Killian was in, he turned pale and explained that these were venomous jellyfish, whose stings were fatal even with a single encounter. Killian's condition deteriorated rapidly. He began losing consciousness. While his friend called for help, Killian heard a voice, a clear, distinct warning: "If you close your eyes, you will never wake up again." To this day, Killian believes it might have been his guardian angel. On the way to the hospital, he felt something surreal, his soul leaving his body. At that very moment, his entire life flashed before his eyes, from his childhood to that exact second. Killian remembers how, in his despair, he started praying. Although he had been a staunch atheist and even mocked religion, he instinctively reached out to God. Not knowing any formal prayers, he spoke in his own words, asking for forgiveness and promising to change his life if he survived. When he finally woke up in the hospital, the doctors were in shock. They could not believe he had returned to life. As Killian slowly regained consciousness, he noticed the frantic activity of doctors and nurses around him. Their actions were swift and precise, but their faces betrayed deep worry and fear. Killian realized how grave his condition was. It seemed to him that the medical staff had already accepted that there was little hope. In their eyes, he saw something akin to resignation, as if they had given up on him. Weak and unable to fight the fatigue any longer, Killian slipped back into unconsciousness. What followed changed Killian Kentucky's life forever. His journey beyond the brink of death and back left him with profound insights about life, faith, and the mysteries of what lies beyond. It's a story of survival against impossible odds, one that continues to inspire wonder and disbelief among those who hear it. When Killian regained consciousness, he found himself in complete darkness. His first question was, "Why is the light off? And where am I?" The oppressive silence pressed down on him, and there was no response. To calm his growing panic, he tried to convince himself that his eyes just needed to adjust to the dark, and soon he would be able to make out shapes or outlines. But that didn't happen. Desperate to orient himself, he reached out for a light switch, groping around the space, but found nothing. He then tried to look at his own hand, bringing it close to his face, only to realize with horror that his hand seemed to pass straight through him. In that moment, he understood. He no longer had a physical body, though he still felt like himself. Later, Killian described the experience this way: "I felt an overwhelming urge to find my body. In the darkness, I wandered aimlessly until I sensed something, or someone, watching me. The feeling was terrifying, as if evil itself was closing in from all sides. Suddenly, I heard a sinister whisper, You deserve to be here." Those words paralyzed me. I had no idea how to escape that place. Terrified, Killian began to pray, something he had never done before. Speaking directly to God, he asked for forgiveness for the mistakes of his life, promising to change if he was given another chance. Then, out of nowhere, a brilliant light burst forth above him, pulling him out of the suffocating darkness. As his soul reached toward the light, he heard a gentle voice ask him, "Do you wish to return to Earth?" Killian was stunned. Someone in this otherworldly place knew his name. Bathed in the light, his surroundings began to come into focus. What he saw was astonishing. A lush green meadow stretched out before him, with a crystal-clear stream winding through it. Along its banks were trees whose leaves and flowers shimmered with radiant, otherworldly hues. The sheer beauty of the scene filled him with awe and peace, as though he was truly seeing the world for the first time. He didn't want to leave, but then he saw visions of his mother and brother. The voice spoke again. "You may stay here if you wish, but if you don't return, people will never know what you've seen. Are you ready to take on that mission?" Killian made his decision. He chose to return. The voice said, "Now open your eyes." When Killian awoke, he saw a doctor staring at him in utter shock, his face pale as a sheet. The nurses stood frozen, astonishment and fear etched into their expressions. For several days after his return, Killian couldn't feel his hands, but he continued to pray, asking God to help him recover. During these moments of prayer, he felt a soothing warmth and a tingling sensation spreading through his body. Slowly but surely, his physical condition began to improve. Later, Killian would say, "I can say with absolute certainty that the afterlife is real. Life continues beyond our earthly existence, though it's something entirely different. Some people go to hell, others to heaven, but the journey doesn't end. It transforms." A similarly dramatic story occurred to a man named Greg Plinter, a university professor who, through an extraordinary twist of fate, found himself in a place where living souls are forbidden to tread. Greg recounted his experience this way. "I used to believe that all answers could be found in science. As a professor and head of my department, I was convinced that humans were the ultimate judges of their own fate. I didn't believe in God and saw religious people as delusional. If I worshipped anything, it was myself. I decided what was good, what was bad, what was true, and what was false. I was a cold, calculating man, fully confident in my own righteousness." This self-assured worldview would soon be challenged in ways Greg could never have imagined. However, everything changed when Greg Plinter experienced clinical death at the age of 38. He claimed that during this time, he found himself in a place that could only be described as the gateway to hell. What he saw there would leave no one indifferent. These shocking events began during a trip to Europe. On that particular day, Greg was in Italy with his wife and a group of students. It was a Saturday, and after a long day exploring the city, Greg returned to his hotel room. As he settled in, he was suddenly struck by an intense, searing pain in his abdomen. The pain was so unbearable that he collapsed to the floor, writhing and clutching his stomach, feeling as though his insides were on fire. As he later recalled, "The pain was so severe that I couldn't even stand. I was rolling on the floor in agony, and eventually, an ambulance had to be called. They took me to a hospital, where the doctors quickly determined that I had a perforated stomach and needed emergency surgery. However, there was no surgeon available, and I was left waiting in the hospital bed without any treatment or relief." As the hours dragged on, a nurse came into his room to check on him. By this point, Greg felt himself growing weaker and weaker. He turned to his wife, who had been by his side the entire time, and said with grim certainty, "I'm dying." Being a staunch atheist, Greg had always dismissed the idea of an afterlife or the existence of a soul. For him, death was the absolute end, a void, devoid of consciousness or continuation. Yet, even as his body shut down, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of pity for himself. The pain grew so overwhelming that eventually, he succumbed and lost consciousness. When Greg came to, what he saw shook him to his core. Just moments earlier, he had been lying on the brink of death, yet now he was standing upright next to his hospital bed. His body felt strangely light, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he had recovered. But his relief quickly turned to horror as he noticed something that defied explanation. The lifeless figure lying on the bed was unmistakably his own. He was staring at himself. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," he would later recall. "I was standing there, fully conscious, while my body remained motionless on the bed. I felt an overwhelming terror and tried to avoid looking at it. How was it possible for me to be in two places at once? Then, Greg noticed the door to his hospital room slightly ajar. Beyond it stretched a dimly lit corridor shrouded in shadows. Strange, humanoid figures lingered in the darkness, and they seemed to be beckoning him to follow. Their movements were unnaturally fluid, and their voices sounded faint, almost like whispers carried by the wind. Curious and desperate for answers, Greg asked, "Dash, are you here to take me to surgery?" One of the figures responded, "Dash, we know what you need. Follow us." Believing that they were there to help him, Greg stepped out into the hallway. As he followed them, the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly. With each step, the faint light faded until he was walking in complete darkness. The oppressive silence was broken only by the shuffling sounds of the figures leading him forward. After a while, Greg began to feel uneasy. He asked again, "Dash, how much further to the operating room?" One of the figures replied curtly, "Dash, there's no time for questions. Every minute matters." At first, Greg complied, but as they moved deeper into the darkness, his unease grew. The figures' previously calm demeanor began to shift. Their voices turned sharper, their words more impatient and hostile. Finally, Greg stopped walking and demanded, "Dash, I won't go any further until you tell me where you're taking me." From the shadows, a voice replied, "Dash, we're almost there." But something in its tone filled Greg with dread. He no longer trusted them. Suddenly, the figures turned on him. He felt invisible hands grabbing at him, pulling and pushing him with increasing force. He tried to resist, but their attacks became more aggressive and violent. It felt as though they were trying to tear him apart, and the air was filled with hysterical, malevolent laughter. "Dash, it was chaos," Greg later recounted. "Dash, I felt like I was being ripped to shreds, and all around me was this horrible, mocking laughter. It was pure evil." Amid the terror, Greg heard a voice, a calm yet urgent whisper that cut through the noise. It said, "Dash, pray." Though he didn't know if it was his guardian angel, a higher power, or his own subconscious, Greg clung to the suggestion like a lifeline. Despite his atheism, he began reciting the prayers he had learned as a child. The words came out awkward and fragmented, but it didn't matter. As he prayed, the attacks began to subside. The figures recoiled, and the laughter faded into silence. Suddenly, beams of light pierced through the darkness, surrounding Greg and lifting him away from the shadowy figures. In this radiant light, he saw his life flash before his eyes. But instead of the successes and achievements he had always prided himself on, he was shown moments of cruelty and indifference. He saw himself speaking harshly to his mother, fighting with his father, and ignoring the pain of others. These scenes overwhelmed him with shame. "Dash, what struck me most," Greg said later, "Dash, was that none of my accomplishments, awards, or accolades were shown. The things I thought defined my life were meaningless. What mattered were my relationships and how I treated people. That was the true measure of my life." When Greg finally returned to his body, he opened his eyes to see his wife's tear-streaked face. Without hesitation, he told her everything he had experienced. Reflecting on the experience later, Greg said, "Dash, I now understand that our time on Earth is not about wealth, success, or power. It's a preparation for something far greater. We are here to choose our eternal destiny. And that choice is made not through our achievements, but through the way we love and care for others."